Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Cardiomyopathy Conversations podcast. Today, we're talking all about Danon disease, and I'm very pleased to say that this episode has been produced alongside the Danon Foundation, whose work is helping to support patients and families with Danon across the world. To help us navigate the complexities of this condition, I'm delighted today to be joined by Professor Juan Pablo Kaski. Professor Kaski has a long list of credentials, so I'm going to read them out. He is a Professor of Pediatric Inherited Cardiovascular Medicine at the UCL Institute of Cardiovascular Science, Head of the UCL Centre for Pediatric Inherited and Rare Cardiovascular Diseases, Consultant Pediatric Cardiologist at Great Ormond Street, and finally, Director of the Great Ormond Street Hospital Centre for Inherited Cardiovascular Diseases. I think we've got the right guy. Professor Kaski, welcome to the Cardiomyopathy Conversations podcast.
Thank you very, very much indeed for inviting me. It's a real honour and pleasure to be here.
It's lovely to have you. Shall we crack off by just asking, if we think about someone who's heard the word Danon disease for the first time, maybe they've just received a diagnosis or one of their family has, how would you explain to that person what Danon disease is?
Yeah, so Danon disease is a rare genetic condition that can affect many different organ systems around the body, including the heart. It's an example of what we call a lysosomal storage disorder. So these are essentially conditions that affect important proteins, enzymes in the cell. The lysosomes are organelles within the cell that are sort of the recycling center of the cell. So when substances that the cell no longer needs need to be disposed of, it's that happens in the lysosomes. And if you have changes in genes that code for certain proteins important in how the lysosomes work, then you get a buildup of these unwanted materials in the cell. And that's what can lead to these conditions. And so Danon disease is an example of one of those lysosomal storage disorders.
The disease itself is caused by a gene called LAMP2. What does that gene normally do? And what happens when it doesn't work quite how it should do?
Yes, exactly. So LAMP2 is so it's the gene that codes for one of these proteins that are important actually for allowing these waste materials in the cell to enter this organelle called the lysosome. So that's its normal job. And so if that protein isn't present or if it's faulty, then those waste materials from the cell can't make it into the lysosome, and so they build up inside the cell.
Is it only LAMP2 that's involved in Danon?
So far, LAMP2 is the only gene that's been associated with Danon disease. There are a number of other conditions that share similar features to Danon disease that are caused by changes in other genes. And so the condition itself can be very similar to other types of condition. But Danon disease really is caused by changes in this particular gene, LAMP2.
Is it possible then to have Danon without an identified genetic cause, like it might be in some of the other cardiomyopathies?
So it's a little bit different to the other cardiomyopathies in that Danon disease really is associated with changes in this particular gene, LAMP2. As I say, there are other conditions that can affect the heart in a very similar way. So, for example, I'm sure we'll come to this, but with thickening of the muscle of the heart and changes in how the ECG looks, for example, that are very suggestive of Danon disease. But there may be other genes that can cause that same sort of picture that you see. But Danon disease really is caused by changes in LAMP2. And so, in fact, one of the ways in which we make the diagnosis of Danon disease in somebody that you suspect might have that condition is by testing for spelling mistakes or deletions in that LAMP2 gene.
Okay, so it's very specifically that gene.
It is.
And obviously we know as it's a genetic disease, it's an inheritable disease, meaning that it runs through families. Can you explain how that inheritance pattern works in Danon disease and what that might mean for a patient and their family?
Yes, so we know that a lot of cardiomyopathies, in fact, a large proportion of cardiomyopathies are inherited, and usually they're inherited in what we call a dominant way. So that essentially means that if somebody has one faulty copy of the gene, there's a 50% chance of passing that on to each of their children. Danon disease is a little different in that it's inherited in what we call an X-linked fashion. So X-linked means that the LAMP2 gene is present in the X chromosome. So it means that the inheritance pattern is slightly different. So women, as you know, have 2 X chromosomes. Males only have 1 X chromosome. I have an X and a Y chromosome. So in order for the condition to express itself, the faulty gene in LAMP2 has to be, or the spelling mistake in LAMP2 has to be present in one of the X chromosomes. And so what essentially this means is that a female, a woman with 1 copy of the faulty Danon gene, so a woman with Danon disease, would have a 50% chance of passing that on to each of her children, whereas a male with Danon disease, who only has 1 X chromosome, and so by definition that LAMP2 protein is faulty in that X chromosome, would have no chance of passing it on to any of his sons, but will always pass it on to his daughters.
Right. It's like I always say with genetics, you start off thinking it's going to be quite simple. It never ends up that way, does it?
No, it isn't, and there are many complexities in terms of the genetics of cardiomyopathies generally. But this is an example of an inheritance pattern that's very important to pick up. So in clinical practice, for example, one of the first things that we do when we meet families with a cardiomyopathy is to ask about the family history, to draw a family tree, and that can sometimes be one of the clues that makes us think, okay, well, this inheritance pattern looks like it's sort of coming down the female line. It seems that the females are passing this on. And so that makes us think, could this be something X-linked like Danon disease?
It's a little bit like being like Sherlock Holmes, isn't it? All of these genetic things. You look for clues and then build a picture. And you need expertise. To do that.
Yeah, and it really is like Sherlock Holmes. And in fact, that really is one of the things that really attracted me to this particular specialty of inherited cardiovascular diseases.
Okay, it would make me run a mile.
Well, it's just, as you say, it really is about sort of looking for clues, not just from a genetic point of view, but particularly something like Danon disease. There are a number of non-cardiac features that are present in this condition in Danon disease that when you see them in combination with the cardiomyopathy should make you think, well, could this be, this is something different to the normal type of cardiomyopathy or the common type of cardiomyopathy that we see. And so it really is about sort of looking for those red flags, sort of clinical red flags, genetic red flags. The family tree is very important, and trying to piece that all together to come to a diagnosis.
I think the other thing, Juan, is we're sitting here on a podcast called Cardiomyopathy Conversations, and we're talking about this rare disease called Danon. What's the connection? Why are we doing that?
So I guess as we've sort of alluded to a little bit earlier on, we know that one of the organs that is very commonly, almost universally affected in Danon disease is the heart. And the most common type of heart involvement that we see with Danon disease is hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, so thickening of the heart muscle. So in many ways, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy may be the initial manifestation of this condition. It may be how an individual presents potentially to a cardiologist. So that's why it's really important to think about all these other red flags that we were talking about. It's a complex situation. So most of what we know about Danon disease comes from males with Danon disease. Because of this X-linked inheritance pattern, boys are often thought to be affected earlier and with a more severe form of the condition. So they often do present with very thick hearts in the context of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy.
We're going to pick up on that a little bit later in the conversation, but I wonder, does that bear itself out in your practice? Do you see that? So
it is true that boys with Danon disease often do present with much more severe forms of the condition. So thicker hearts, they often have something called pre-excitation or Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome. So this is an extra electrical pathway that can lead to abnormal heart rhythms from the top chamber of the heart. And so those features and then a number of extra cardiac features, so involvement of other organ systems in the body, do tend to be quite severe in boys who present with this condition. And I know we'll talk about sort of females with Danon disease later. The sort of paradigm for a long time has been that females with Danon disease have much milder disease, that it presents much later on, and that in many cases it presents almost with a different type of cardiomyopathy. So it tends to be dilated cardiomyopathy that the paradigm suggests is how females present. But as we'll talk about, that doesn't necessarily bear out in clinical practice.
Yeah. And I think also, we're talking about cardiomyopathy and how Danon presents within the heart. Many people are surprised to learn that Danon affects other organs as well. Can you tell us a little bit about what other parts of the body are involved, and if it's possible for people to know symptoms to look for, or that they might say, oh, I've got this symptom, this is potentially something I should worry about?
So that's a great question. And actually, there are a number of different organ systems that can be involved in Danon disease. And here again, there are differences between males and females. So the heart is a muscle. And so we know that also individuals with Danon disease can also have weakness of their skeletal muscles. So they may have sort of muscle pains or delays in sort of gross motor skills, so delays in walking, for example, can be one of the ways in which this can present.
That must be quite difficult, because in a child, you would think, muscle pain, that could be just growing pains. I suppose developmental delay would be one thing that would spark curiosity. Absolutely.
So developmental delay, in fact, is another of the features that we often see in association with Danon disease, again, particularly in males. A very characteristic extracardiac feature of Danon disease is something called a pigmentary retinopathy. So these are it's an eye condition. And in fact, in some cases, and in fact in some families that we have looked after, the diagnosis is made as a result of the finding of a pigmentary retinopathy that then triggers a search for a genetic cause.
Would it always trigger that?
It may do.
Or you may end up in ophthalmology and staying in ophthalmology and never go any further.
So that is the problem with rare diseases in fact, across the board, that often there is this sort of diagnostic odyssey, this sort of delay in reaching a diagnosis, because we often work in silos, and so many times, almost always, and so it's not unusual actually for individual conditions to be looked after by specialists in that area, but without necessarily thinking about trying to put it all together. Exactly, and I think that's going back to the sort of Sherlock Holmes analogy. That's exactly why it's important to have centres and specialists who specialise in these rare conditions and really sort of rare disease units in a way, so that we can put all of these clues together and reach a diagnosis earlier.
Yeah. I like the phrase diagnostic odyssey, because I can imagine in something like Danon, I mean, we know that in the rare disease community anyway, getting a diagnosis takes around about 7 years, I think. That must be very difficult and quite arduous, I would imagine, for the patient who's involved. Or even though we're thinking of Danon now, we've already talked about Wolff Parkinson White, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, dilated cardiomyopathy. To the person who is new to this, they might be thinking, gosh, how many diagnoses have I got here? What is it? What does it look like? What do you think a typical diagnostic journey looks like in Danon disease?
So I think it's very variable, actually. And I think it really depends on what the initial symptoms in that patient are, and also to an extent where they're seen for the first time. So, it's not in males in particular, it's about trying to piece together all of those diagnostic clues. So hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is fairly common in the general population.
Still gets missed.
But it gets missed. Wolff Parkinson White is fairly common. But when you put those two together, there are very few things that tend to cause that combination of features, for example. And so it's having that sort of understanding that these two conditions, and sometimes even more than two conditions, might actually be related. And sort of thinking, well, what could it be that is causing this? And actually in the context of Danon disease, that's really important. So some years ago, there was a study that was published looking at the yield of genetic testing in adults with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And in that population, I think something like 3 or 4% had mutations in the LAMP2 gene. But these were, individuals with a diagnosis of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy without any suspicion of something else going on.
Wow.
The yield of testing for LAMP2 mutations is about 20% or almost 20% in people who have hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and Wolff-Parkinson-White. And so the importance really of identifying those clues, those sort of red flags that make you think, is there a possible explanation for these potentially disparate symptoms that we're seeing? And I think that is part of the diagnostic odyssey, actually. It's sort of finding somebody who can put that together.
Spot on, finding somebody who thinks in that way. Is LAMP2 part of the standard HCM, DCM panel?
So it is now. So it's part of the standard.
Is that true worldwide?
That's a great question. So genetic testing, and so access to genetic testing is very different across the world. The sort of testing that's done is also very different in different parts of the world. So we have an international pediatric hypertrophic cardiomyopathy consortium that we've been sort of leading for the last few years. And actually one of the things that we looked at very recently was exactly that, is how many people have access to genetic testing in the first place, and then when they do, what sort of testing is offered. And there's huge variation even within expert centres across Europe and across the world.
It's tricky, isn't it? Because I think we're very lucky in the UK where we are now that we do have good access to genetic testing. Not the same everywhere.
It really isn't. And so we're lucky we have good access, and not just to testing, but also to expert genetic counselling.
Yes.
Which I think is also really important.
Really important, yeah. It's such a complex thing. You have to have somebody who understands and can explain and has time to explain. I think genetic counselling is crucial. We've touched a little bit on the difference between Danon in males and in females. Before we go a little bit deeper into that sort of topic, can you give us a general sense of how it differs in males and females?
Sure. So the sort of original traditional paradigm is that males present earlier with much more severe cardiac involvement, so with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, with often very thick hearts, with a higher risk of progression to needing a heart transplant, often in their sort of late teens and 20s, and with a risk of sudden cardiac death. And the traditional paradigm is that females present later with milder disease, often with more of a dilated cardiomyopathy phenotype, and often require transplantation maybe in their 40s or 50s.
The whole concept of females presenting later isn't a new one in medicine, is it? Do you think it's because in Danon the disease actually presents itself later? Or is it just the same story that generally women and females are less likely to, go to the doctor or be taken seriously, or, the same old?
I think it's a combination of those two things. So for Danon disease, because it is X-linked, there are many examples of X-linked diseases where, because women have two X chromosomes, the sort of normal gene, in inverted commas, on the other unaffected chromosome often exerts a sort of protective effect. It sort of dampens down the potential effect of the faulty gene on the X chromosome. So there is a little bit of that. So we know that in many cases that paradigm is true. So females do present later with slightly milder or a different form of disease. I wouldn't say milder. But there probably is also something about under-recognition of Danon disease in females. And part of the reason for that is that some of the other manifestations, non-cardiac manifestations, tend to be less common in females. So things like developmental delay, for instance, or the skeletal myopathy tends to be milder or not present at all, certainly in younger girls. And so that sometimes means that people don't think about the possibility of Danon disease in a girl because it's X-linked and because these other features aren't present. But it's certainly the case that girls with Danon disease can present with very severe phenotypes that are exactly the same as what we see in males. So even in my own clinical practice, we look after a number of girls with Danon disease whose clinical features, certainly from a cardiac point of view, are indistinguishable from males. So they have very thick hearts with Wolff-Parkinson White and often a pigmentary retinopathy, but perhaps without some of the other features like the skeletal muscle disease or the developmental delay. So I think raising awareness of the possibility of Danon disease even in young girls is really crucial.
Absolutely. And we're going to hear a story now about where that has shown itself in quite a dramatic way.
Hi, I'm Amy Atkinson. I'm one of the co-founders of the Danon Foundation. Danon disease came into our life with my daughter Delaney. She was born in 2006, and at the age of 4, her pediatrician had discovered that she had a heart murmur. We went to cardiology and found out that she had hypertrophic cardiomyopathy that was diagnosed at the age of 5. We started our genetic testing, which confirmed the Danon diagnosis. She was placed with an ICD before going to kindergarten. I was typical mom. We went to cardiology once a year and just lived our life. In 2018, at the age of 11, Delaney had a major stroke, which put us in immediate heart failure and started our journey to transplant. She did receive her gift of a new heart in 2018 in September. Her body was a little more deteriorated than we anticipated. And after her successful heart surgery, she did not wake up from surgery. We took her off life support on September 26th of 2018. I have spent the last 8 years fighting for the Danon Foundation and the Danon disease and the people living with Danon and making sure that they understand that they're not alone.
So for a long time, as you've just mentioned, the female sort of presentation of Danon, less severe, less progressive, that wasn't the case for Amy and her daughter and her family. So would you say that Danon then is more of a spectrum? There's not so much of a typical pattern in females or males. It's more of a spectrum.
Without question. And I think that's the case, across not just cardiovascular disease, but across disease generally. But I think that's definitely the case in Danon disease. And we see that in the most sort of obvious way in females with Danon disease, where, there are some women with Danon disease who do present much later on with a very different phenotype. So not necessarily hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, but more of a dilated cardiomyopathy phenotype. It's still severe disease because the natural history is that they often end up needing heart transplantation, but it tends to happen a little bit later. And at the same time, we have families where we see evidence of very significant cardiovascular disease, even in young girls, even in prepubescent girls. And so there's no question that this is a spectrum of disease. And so actually, when we think about Danon disease, I think it's really important that we don't just sort of think, oh, well, this is only something that affects boys in the pediatric population and that you might
We like to
see
put
it
things
in
in
girls.
boxes, though, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think with diseases like this, you haven't got a hope, really.
No, and particularly when it's a rare disease and we know how difficult it is to make these diagnoses in the first place.
Yeah.
And so really having an open mind and thinking about all of the possibilities is crucial.
Must be difficult, I would imagine, if you're somebody that doesn't necessarily have access to expertise. They might not get referred to an expert centre. Do you think there are a lot of people who are sort of out there in the population who are not being diagnosed?
So I think with rare disease generally, absolutely. I think that's the case. Even in non-rare disease, we sort of alluded to earlier on, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, I'm sure there are a lot of individuals out there who have the condition who aren't being diagnosed. Danon disease is a rare disease. There's no question about it. So I would be surprised if there were hundreds and hundreds of people in the UK with a diagnosis of Danon disease who haven't been diagnosed. But I think the key is more that the diagnosis is made late. So it takes a long time for those things to be put together. And I think access to expertise is one of the reasons for that, but also sort of awareness of, or a lack of awareness of the possibility of these rare diseases is another. I think we're in an age now where medicine is changing, and actually the way that we practice medicine is different, but also there have been huge advances in terms of bringing people together. So things like telemedicine and the advent of artificial intelligence, etc. So I think all of those things could be harnessed to improve the sort of diagnostic journey, let's say, of people with rare diseases.
Improve the odyssey.
Indeed. Indeed.
Hi, my name is Jenny Shea, and I'm one of the co-founders of the Danon Foundation. My journey with Danon disease started years ago when I was in the process of family planning. And because of my age, I was considered a geriatric pregnancy, where I got a series of tests that led to my Danon diagnosis. I'm very fortunate today that I am asymptomatic, but I still get checked annually to make sure that I'm not progressing with symptoms or heart disease or any other issues. Last year, I had a scare and I went through a battery of tests. And to be honest, every time I get a blood work done or, have shortness of breath because something is stressing me out, or maybe run too fast chasing my kids around, it always brings up the fact that at the end of the day, there's a possibility that it could be Danon. And I live with that fear, but I also don't let it define me. And for me, doing something about it is why I put so much time and energy into supporting the community and trying to do more for research and information that helps us as a community learn more about this rare disease. There is no cure and there's no approved treatment today. We manage symptoms, and most of our community members end up proceeding to transplant. And that's a totally different disease or issue to live with than Danon, but you still have all of the other symptoms that you need to live with. And that impacts the quality of life. Separately, but related, one of the biggest challenges in our community is the support for women. Women can often be considered more mild in terms of their disease, but we know that's not true. We know that women can have disease just as severe as the men or the boys. And on top of that, women are often the caregivers who make decisions about their child's care who is also living with Danon disease. So all of these things combined, to me, put a really disproportionate burden on our females. And so while I advocate for the broader Danon community, I especially advocate for the women. And I continue to speak out for those who cannot or have no time or energy or platform to share that information. And my work with the Danon Foundation continues because I have a goal to be around for my kids, watch them grow up, and I want the rest of the rare disease community around the world that lives with Danon disease to have that opportunity as well.
Some Danon families have noticed that within their own particular family, there seems to be a change in women, girls, when there's a hormonal change. So around puberty, pregnancy, is there something about hormonal changes that affects how the disease presents, or whether it actually is like a Kickstarter to actually express the gene?
So that's a great question. And we know across all cardiomyopathy phenotypes that puberty is often a time when things change. And we see that in sarcomeric hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and dilated cardiomyopathies, etc. So there's no question that there is an influence of things like hormones and many other environmental factors. Whether the same applies to Danon disease, and particularly Danon disease in girls, I think the honest answer is that we just don't know yet, because there's such little research that has been done in females with Danon disease. And I think, partly it's because it's a rare disease, because we're, still learning about it. And but also I think there is this sort of idea that for a long, long time, females with Danon disease were not felt to be sort of or Danon disease was not felt to be something that affected young girls and teenage girls. And so I think this is definitely an area of unmet need.
Yes, I think the families with Danon would probably agree with that, and look forward to that, new horizon. I think one of the main things for women with Danon is considerations for pregnancy. What do we know? Do we know anything about going through a pregnancy with Danon?
So again, there are really limited data on pregnancy specifically in Danon disease. From a cardiac point of view, we have the experience of other forms of cardiomyopathies, so hypertrophic and dilated cardiomyopathies. And so there is some evidence that can be extrapolated from that. I think the really important thing is that if a woman with Danon disease is planning a pregnancy, that actually they have access to expert care actually from the time of planning. And this applies across all cardiomyopathies. But having access to cardiologists with expertise in heart disease during pregnancy. But with Danon disease, it's more than just the heart. And so I think that's really important.
Yes.
So it's not just sort of maternal cardiology, but actually it's maternal medicine, as you say.
Yes, yeah.
Because all of the other features will also need to be taken into account.
Are there specific considerations for women who know that they are carriers of the LAMP2 gene, but they haven't yet expressed that disease? Are there considerations for that group of women in terms of pregnancy?
So I guess the most important consideration there is the not necessarily during pregnancy itself, but it's the possibility of passing that to their baby. And so I think, a big part of, we talked about genetic counselling before, a big part of genetic counselling is around that sort of pregnancy issue. And in some countries, there is, for example, the possibility of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis for many cardiovascular diseases. So as a way of potentially preventing the inheritance of a condition such as Danon disease.
It's incredible that we can do these things now, isn't it? It's mind-blowing, really. Do you think that there's a difference in being a carrier of the LAMP2 gene in cardiomyopathy to being a carrier of any of the other cardiomyopathy causing genes? Is it different in any way?
That's a really good question to ask sort of patients with or individuals with Danon disease, etc. I think, there are some similarities in the sense that these are individuals who are healthy and fit, but have a genetic condition that could be passed on. So I think in some ways that's common to all cardiomyopathies. But I think there are things that are different because with Danon disease, again, as far as we know, in women with Danon disease, the penetrance of the condition seems to be quite high. So that means that it's very likely that individual will become affected by the condition at some point, even if they haven't got any features at this stage. And because it's a multi-system condition, it's not just the heart. That's different to gene carriers in dilated cardiomyopathy, sarcomeric cardiomyopathy, where it's generally only the heart that's involved. And so
it's so difficult to live with all of this knowledge that you're carrying this gene. You could pass it on. It could present in the heart. It could present in your muscle. Living with that is quite a challenge, I would imagine.
Absolutely. And I think, again, we need more research into this to understand exactly, not just from a medical point of view or a clinical point of view, how this condition develops and what the differences are between males and females, but actually from a patient point of view to understand what the impact of these conditions is on patients. And we go back again to genetic counselling, but actually genetic counselling, psychology support, all of these things are really crucial with anybody with a cardiomyopathy, but I think particularly so for conditions like Danon disease that are rare, that we don't fully understand, and where the implications go beyond just the heart.
What would you say, if anything, has changed in recent years in terms of our understanding of Danon disease?
So as with many things in cardiovascular medicine, one of the things that drives advances is the development of therapies. And I think Danon disease is a really good example of that, because there is now a gene therapy available for patients with, at the moment, males with Danon disease. But as a result of that, there is an understanding that we need to understand the natural history of the condition a lot better. So alongside the interventional gene therapy trials, the companies that are working on gene therapy trials are also really interested in developing natural history trials so that we, or studies, so that we can understand how the condition develops, what are the factors that perhaps influence expression of the LAMP2 gene differentially, in males and in females, and so that's a major change, because there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of money that's going into this, and so that's often the way in which advances happen.
That's, I imagine, incredibly exciting for the Danon community, and we've seen the same with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy with the advent of, cardiac myosin inhibitors, which has completely driven, interest, investment in that condition. It's really important.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think this is particularly the case for rare diseases, because for a long time, rare diseases were considered the sort of Cinderellas of cardiovascular medicine. Most of the sort of infrastructure, most of the money that sort of goes into research goes into common diseases, understandably, and so rare diseases get left behind. But that's changing now with things like gene therapies and other sort of genomic-based therapies. So,
do you think, as a clinician, in terms of what interests you, sort of what lights your fire medically, is it unusual for somebody like you to be looking into these rare diseases? Are you unique? Well, obviously you are, but in the medical community, or is it a particular type of person that says, I want to go and look into these really rare diseases, as opposed to somebody who says, I'd really like to be a GP?
I think that there is a change in terms of how we view these sort of specialties. I think I'm sort of unusual in the sense that I'm a pediatric cardiologist working in the field of cardiomyopathies. Much of cardiomyopathy has been sort of led by adult cardiologists, even though these are conditions that often present in childhood. But then, I guess in a way that makes it more understandable that we're focusing on rarer diseases, because often pediatric cardiac diseases are rare compared to the really common things like ischemic heart disease, etc.
Maybe in the pediatric.
Very often that's where rare diseases present. So something like 60 or 70% of rare diseases affect children, present in childhood.
Are we talking about children, sort of anyone under the age of 16?
Yes, although many of these rare diseases, not Danon disease specifically, and perhaps not cardiac rare diseases generally, but many rare diseases often do present in really young children. So in the first, under the age of 5, often. Because they're often because they're rare, because they're very severe conditions, and so they tend to manifest very early on.
Yeah. What would you say then? I mean, we've talked a little bit about the fact that we need more research, particularly into how Danon affects females. What would you say is the biggest gap at the moment in terms of our knowledge of Danon disease? Where does that gap lie?
I think there are many gaps, really. So I think, without question, understanding the natural history of the disease in females and sort of early, and the sort of understanding why Danon disease affects some organs more than others in females compared to males is one of the sort of areas that we really don't understand, and there's a lot of research that needs to go into that. But I think just generally in sort of rare cardiovascular disease, really an understanding of how the condition develops, how somebody goes from being a gene carrier, and this applies in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, dilated cardiomyopathy as well, how somebody goes from being a gene carrier to expressing the condition. What are the things that cause that to happen? Because even in the same family, it's not, and we see this even in Danon disease families, it's not unusual for the condition to express itself very differently in different members of the same family.
Really?
So what are the things that lead to that happening? And And ultimately, I guess one of the
How on
reasons.
earth do you design a trial to do that?
Yeah, so I think
It's not easy, is it?
it's not easy, and particularly not in the context of rare disease. And I think the only way that this can be done is by collaboration. So that's without question international collaboration. And ultimately, the reason for doing that is that you want to be able to develop treatments that stop that from happening. But you can't do that unless you really understand how it happens in the first place and what are the things that lead to that happening. So, in a way, it's extremely exciting.
Yes, absolutely.
And now that we have this sort of impetus of gene therapy trials, for example, being available, I think it's a great time to be involved in this area.
I agree. I think across the spectrum of cardiomyopathies, it is a very, very exciting time.
Yeah, completely agree.
So you are actually involved in one of the clinical trials that's exploring gene therapy for Danon disease. Can you help people try and understand what that gene therapy is trying to do?
Yeah, so at Great Ormond Street, we're one of the, so we are the UK site for the Danon disease gene therapy trial, which at the moment is recruiting males, so boys from the age of 8 onwards with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And the purpose of the trial really is to try to replace the faulty gene with a properly functioning LAMP2 protein, essentially. So it's, the clinical trials are quite involved. They're quite intensive. The way that the gene therapy is delivered is through an inactivated virus. So it's a viral vector, which is successful in that it delivers the product into the heart, but it can be associated with a number of different side effects. And so there's a lot of monitoring that's required. Immunosuppression is also required to prevent the sort of body reacting to the virus. So there are lots of things that need to be thought about with trials like this. But essentially, the idea is that if we can get a non-faulty gene to express itself in the muscle of the heart, that will produce a normal protein, and so it will allow these sort of waste products of the cell to enter into the lysosomes to be broken down and recycled.
Just feels like science fiction, doesn't it? It really does.
Yeah, I think if we were having this conversation, maybe even 5 or 10 years ago, people would be thinking this is mad. This is this is something that can never be done. But there are many examples of successful gene therapies that have already entered the clinical arena, not in cardiovascular disease. Actually, Danon gene therapy trial is I think the first gene therapy program in clinical trials for cardiovascular disease. There are others now. So there are other gene therapy trials now for other forms of cardiomyopathies. But I think the Danon disease one was probably the first cardiomyopathy gene therapy.
How far along are we with that trial? Are any sort of signals yet?
So the sort of preliminary results were published a couple of years ago, I think, or maybe last year, in the New England Journal of Medicine. We weren't involved in that. That was the sort of the original trial. Again, with promising results. This trial is now ongoing. This is the phase 2 trial. Recruitment, I understand, is going well, and we should hopefully have some results in the not too distant future. I think the main concern. So the main sort of output from this will be to understand whether it enters the heart, and whether it changes something that we can measure in the heart. And then the second thing that's really important is, can this be delivered safely? So can it be done without significant
It's quite a long way to go.
effects? So
yet,
there are. Yeah, I think so. But it's incredibly exciting.
Yeah, it's very exciting, I think, for the Danon community to be the first, a bit ahead of the game with that. As we come to a close, just 2 more questions. If you could ask the medical and research community to do one thing differently with regard to Danon patients, what would it be?
Oh, that's a great question. So, I think, for Danon disease and just more generally, I think collaboration is key. These are rare diseases. There is expertise out there. You're making the most of. We owe that to the patients to make the most of the expertise that's available. And I think real advances can only really happen by collaborating internationally. I think, we mentioned sort of clinicians working in silos earlier on. I think in many ways, the same thing applies in academia, that you have your own interest and very, very focused on this particular thing. And
Yes.
But there are other people out there who are also working on similar things that are complementary and synergistic. And so bringing that sort of expertise together is absolutely crucial, not just for Danon disease, but
across the board.
Cardiovascular disease generally.
Absolutely. Less siloed thinking. Yeah, completely. And finally, what would you want to say as a clinician and as a researcher to the Danon community in terms of hope for the future? I think these gene replacements are really exciting, but what would your message be to the Danon community across the world?
So the first thing I would say is thank you for actually engaging with clinicians and researchers in this. Actually, a lot of the advances in rare disease generally, and certainly in the field of Danon disease, only come about because of the advocacy of patients and families with these conditions. So that's really, really important. And again, thinking about silos, actually a really crucial part of the sort of collaboration is that it's not just between researchers or clinicians, but it's also patients, patient advocates, and industry. So all of those stakeholders have to come together. But in terms of hope, I think I think these are really exciting times. I think the fact that we already have a clinical trial for a gene therapy for Danon disease is a great step forward.
Fantastic, yeah.
There are many other programs in Danon disease that are currently under development also. So there will be other trial designs, there will be other gene-based therapies, and maybe other types of therapies that become available in the next few years.
It's really exciting, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It really is exciting. Professor Kaski, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. Thank you so much for your expertise. Thank you for championing the Danon community and research and care for people in Danon disease. And thanks very much for joining me on the podcast.
No, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure and a privilege to be here.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.